As we've told you before, a 2013 report from UNL's Department of Agricultural Economics showed how property taxes had made Nebraska's ag sector the heavy lifter of local government services. From 2012 to 2013, ag land accounted for 87% of the state's total land valuation increase. Governor Pete Ricketts has said property tax reform is one of his top focus areas, but the Nebraska unicameral has been unable to enact significant legislation. The Omaha World Herald reported last week a legislative supercommittee recently ended months of study on the topic with no specific proposals for change. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben and asked why property tax has been so difficult to reform.
It's interesting. You deal with property tax reform, and clearly the ag community is very aware of where property taxes have gone, more than doubled in the last 10 years in terms of the property taxes that ag is paying. But it's a difficult proposition to reform something that is such a fundamental part of financing local services, particularly schools. You've got schools that make up 60% of a property tax bill. So if you want to reform property taxes, you really end up reforming school funding as well.
How much do property taxes contribute to the overall pot?
Well, if schools are 60% of the property tax bill and it turns out that property taxes are about 50% of total school funding, any formula, any policy choice to reform one is going to have to involve the other.
Tell me about the K through 12 money that it brings in, and kind of this discussion about if you touch one, you have to, talk about reforming the other.
Right. Well, fundamentally, if you talk about property tax reform, many of the components of the property tax bill for a producer really do rise and fall in value with the assessment. So there's at least sort of an equilibrium between demand for services and sort of cost to the taxpayer. But public schools are one of those challenging things where the costs of schools may not move very closely with the underlying value of property in the district. So the property tax bill and the demands on schools do not necessarily move together. It's that shock to the system, particularly here in the last decade as farmland values have gone substantially higher, assessed values have gone higher, and the amount of taxes that farmland is contributing to public funding for schools relative to the amount of taxes that non-farm property is contributing. Farmland's picked up a much bigger share. It's actually turned around the state formula such that instead of rural districts getting much of the state aid, it's now the urban districts that are getting much of the state aid, and the shift in aid is put even more pressure on local taxes.
What are the realistic options here to making some advancement in this area?
We've seen a number of proposals and a number of alternatives discussed, and certainly landowners, agricultural interests have been pushing for more effort. In the last legislative session, the primary reform came about in the sense of an increase to the property tax rebate. That's the line on your property tax bill that reduces the total amount owed. But there's lots of additional ideas, extremely challenging choices. Do you address assessment of farmland, either shifting the methodology for assessing to something a little more stable, farm income, earning potential instead of land values? Do you reduce the assessed valuation rate? That gives some short-term relief. It may not solve the finance issue. Fundamentally, this is about addressing the finance question. Do you readdress the school aid formula or the total amount of state aid to schools? If so, where do you find the funds to do so? And then you also have to fight, or at least balance that with other demands on state dollars and sources of dollars. So lots of battles ahead.
Right. In that you mentioned one of these things, if you take it away from property taxes, certainly it's got to come from somewhere else, right?
It has to come from somewhere. If it seems that the only way to sort of reform property taxes is to find additional aid elsewhere, then you're going to have to find work on sales tax or income tax that helps more closely match needs with sources. It's an extremely difficult challenge, and fundamentally one of the challenges is a basic economic concept. Are you trying to maximize the output given some fixed budget, or are you trying to minimize the cost given some fixed output? Are we trying to, is there an acceptable level of sort of school output, graduation rates, state performance on state tests, et cetera? Is there an acceptable level of output and we can economize on how we deliver it? We could look at alternatives that might be more efficient delivery mechanisms. Or is it about we have a funding base, we use as much of that funding base as we can, and we provide as many opportunities as we can with that base? In this whole formula, it's not just about property tax reform and the amount of school aid and the sources of funds. It's fundamentally about local districts that also make choices about what kind of school system do we have. That makes it complicated.